Pleasure to be here. I had met a few American ranchers before I came here, and a couple of years ago, one of my fellows who has a ranch in where I come from, he's a big rancher and always talks big. He rang me up and said, Brad, come over, we've got an American rancher coming to see us. So I went over there and I met this American rancher. I think he was from Texas. Anyway, he rocked up and we got in the farm vehicle, and the Texas rancher said, hell, this ain't a farm vehicle. In Texas, our farm vehicles are twice as big as that. So we drove down the road and he said, how big's your spread? And he told him, he said, in Texas, our spreads are twice as big as that. So we went along the road further and we saw a mob of cattle. And he said, are these your cattle? And my friend said, yep. He said, in Texas, our cattle are twice as big as that. So by this time, a friend was getting a bit cheesed off, so we drove down the road and a mob of kangaroos flew in front of us. And that Texas guest said, what in the devil are they? And he said, they're the Australian mosquito. So we put him in his place. But look, on a serious note, it's great to be here at the RCAF convention, catching up with old friends Rick and Teresa Fox. It's wonderful. I didn't bring my wife here, but I brought my sister Jill here along with me. And I'm here to help you guys stop RFID being mandated in the USA, because it has been an absolute disaster for us. So what I'll do in three parts, I will talk about, give you a quick overview of the Australian beef industry, and then talk about RFID, and I'll talk a bit about trade as well, and also the pricing of cattle in Australia. So where we sit at the moment, we're about 25 million people. Our cattle herd size is 26 to 27 million head. We peaked in 2011 at about 29 to 30 million head of cattle. So we slaughter about 7 to 8 million slaughter cattle a year. Our domestic market consumes 600,000 tonnes of beef, which has dropped dramatically over the last 20 years. We're at 24.5 kilos per person. 20 years ago, we were eating 40 kilos per person. And the problem there has been because we have a supermarket duopoly in Australia, with Coles and Woolworths selling most of the beef. They've got together with the processors and forced the price of beef up at retail. So with a high price of beef, consumers have gone to chicken and pork. So Australia is the world's third biggest exporter of beef. These are figures from the 12 months to June, and you can see who our major export in volume destinations are, and those figures are up around about 12% on the year before. So you guys, as you can see, are very big consumers of Australian beef. And the reason why that is because the Australians produce a very lean meat. So we produce mince at what they call 90 CL, which is 90% meat, 10% fat. So your manufacturers over here buy our lean trim, mixed with your trim, which contains a high level of fat, about 40%, and then that averages out to about a 75, 80% chemical lean, which is ideal for hamburgers. So most of our beef goes into manufacturing. So live export is a big volume. We export a lot of cattle, live exports, mostly to Indonesia, a growing market in China. In 2011, we were exporting up to 1.2, 1.3 million head of cattle. You've probably heard in Australia, I don't know whether you heard in America, but we had a program on television in 2011 which showed Indonesian slaughtermen inhumanely killing cattle. So that went nationwide. The meat processors and the unions, the Australian Meat Workers Union, and the animal rights activists got together and they were going to try and close the live export market down, because the demand was so great in Indonesia and Thailand for our product, the live export buyers were coming into traditional meat processing areas and taking cattle and forcing the price of cattle up. So they were successful in lobbying the government to shut down the live export trade. So overnight, our cattle price dropped to a third. Over 1.5 million cattle came from the north of Australia, flooded our sale yards in the south. The meat processors turned a $100 a head profit into a $500 a head profit on a 400 kilo steer. So of course, the organisation I represent, the Australian Beef Association, we went into overdrive, explained to the public, who were horrified by seeing these animals mistreated, that the real effect was that nearly 1 million head of cattle were dying in Central Australia because there was no market, a drought hit, and farmers could not get them off their property. So it reopened, and it's just still in the recovery phase at the moment. Now, the NILS introduction was first brought into Australia in about 1999 as part of our admission into the EU. So the EU wanted to trace back. The Cattle Council, which is like your NCBA, offered them NLIS tags, radio frequency tags. And they thought that it would be voluntarily adopted right across Australia. Now, even though the EU offered a 20 cents a kilo premium for our cattle, the cost of doing and the hassle of doing NLIS meant that there wasn't enough beef to supply a 7,000 tonne quota. So the government thought, right, we're going to mandate NLIS. So it was slowly rolled out, Victoria first, which is in the south, then it was mandated across Australia in 2005. So the objective of the livestock traceability system was to identify and track movements from birth to slaughter, designed to provide quality assurance to our trading partners, assist in disease control, and sustain a competitive advantage for Australian meat market. That's what we were told. So what happens is, once you move a beast, a cow of any description from your property, it must have a radio frequency identification tag attached to its ear, and within 2 days of that animal leaving your property, the tag must be scanned and downloaded to a central database. And then when those cattle are then slaughtered, the tag is read again, and those tags are taken off the central database. We also have a document called, which I won't go into, it'll take too long, but it's called the LPA NVD, which is Livestock Production National Vendor Declaration. So that's a piece of paper in duplicate or in triplicate that you must sign, denoting your PIC number, that's your property identification number, which you're issued with. You send a copy with a truck driver, a copy goes to your agent, and you keep a copy for your records. And the NVD PIC number is meant to match the tag number, which is on the outside of the tag, but not the inside, to make it even more complicated. So this is how the system works. So if you have cattle that were bred on your property, and you're the breeder, and you send them off the property, then you have a white breeder tag. And the idea is these white breeder tags should stay in the cattle's ear for life, and every time they download on the database, if you buy cattle from vendor-bred cattle with a white ear tag in their ear, it's downloaded on the database, you're fine. Now, if your cattle aren't, when it was first introduced, weren't bred on your property, you had to use an orange ear tag. Now, if the white ear tag fell out, by law, you were meant to replace it with an orange ear tag. But what is happening is the processors started discounting cattle that had the orange ear tag. So what everyone does now, if a white ear tag falls out, you just whack another white ear tag in. So it was just a way of them getting cheaper cattle. So these are some of the most basic costs, and I'll go into the overall costs later on, but you're looking at between $370 and $420 for purchasing tags. Now you have applicators, which can range in price from a little cheap Chinese $40 thing that works once and never works again, to wands which cost about $1,700, some to $2,500. You have to have computer systems and software. We don't have to, but you need it really if you're downloading large numbers of cattle. Now the interesting part is when the Australian Beef Association were fighting NLIS, we said the total cost was $36 a head, and that included handling fee, weight loss of the cattle, getting them in the yards and tagging them. They said we were out of our brain, we didn't know what we were talking about, and now what's happened is the sale yards have adopted the ABA costs for replacing lost tags, so that's $36 for a lost tag. And of course you've got the extra labour costs and also the work with traceability costs. So before it was introduced, we went around the countryside and tried to get farmers to stand up and say no to it. So the ABA held meetings across the country, attended by 4,000 to 5,000 producers. I put an ad in the Land newspaper, which is Australia's biggest rural weekly, and with a voting slip asking producers to vote yes or no for NLIS. In a month I had 1,877 against it, 22 for it. At the ABA meetings, people were virtually unanimously against NLIS, but they ignored that because our Cattle Council, MLA, NFF and state farming organisations all wanted it. So what's actually happening, when it was bedded down, we started getting calls from producers because we're in the public eye as being opposed to it, and we were noticing that they had huge discrepancies with their NLIS database account. So some had less cattle on there than they should have, some had more cattle on there than they should have had. It was a complete mess. Tags were falling out of cattle's ears within 6 months of being applied. Cattle, when you're rushed, putting big mobs of cattle on trucks, sending them to market, you're quickly trying to grab a cow's ear to tag it. Tags were falling out in the trucks on the way to the market. You'd go to a sale yard, and down at the wash bay, there were NLIS tags all over the ground. So we complained about this, and they said, we'll get improved tags that stay in better. So ABA sparked an audit into NLIS, an efficacy audit to see how well it was working. So what we found that not all farmers were complying, discrepancy between database and producers' records, insufficient scrutiny of the system, and of course there was no backup plan if the network systems go down. So you can imagine in Australia, as a landmass nearly as big as you guys, but we have a very sparsely populated interior, very poor internet access. On some of the bigger places, one of our members, he rang me in sheer frustration, swearing down the phone. He'd said he'd just spent 3 days with helicopters bringing in 4,000 head of cattle. They went to scan them, the scanner broke down. They had to bring another one, wait for 4 hours, chop it in from Rockhampton, to bring another one in. The dust hit that and that broke down. They had to let all the cattle out and then bring them in a week later. The expense was enormous. So these were the basic findings of our report. So what we found was about 20% of cattle in the database, live and slaughtered, did not have lifetime traceability. So therefore NLIS could not be relied on for disease control nor for market access advantages. So if you want to use NLIS for disease control, it must be 100% accurate. Dr. Max was talking about foot and mouth disease. We have 24 million wild pigs in Australia. If foot and mouth got into the country, those pigs aren't tagged and it would spread everywhere. 2 weeks ago I bought some heifers. The heifers were on my property for 6 months being agisted, and I bought them off the fellow who was agisting the cattle on my place. When I went to download them on the database, I would have thought it was okay because they should have been converted to my pick. But 6 months later, they were still on another pick up in Queensland, 500 kilometres away. If my heifers went to the sale yards, they detected disease, they wouldn't come back and quarantine me, they'd quarantine the fellow who had the cattle 300 kilometres away in Queensland. So it's just stupid, it's crazy. So we had 34% of cattle that were actually slaughtered had lost their lifetime traceability. As you can see, there's some with orange and some with white. So at that stage, we suggested we've got about a 22% loss of traceability. So we went to the government and said, look, you need, the retention rates are shocking. The tag retention rates are not recorded naturally. And the standard for RFID tags, which are required to maintain structural integrity for 7 years, they were crumbling, the plastic was crumbling in your hand after 12 months in the hot Australian sun. So of course, with the disease outbreak, the problems of course occur mostly at sale yards. There's a high risk of disease outbreaks there. Time is costly in reapplying lost tags, potential for losing all traceability. And that's what you need, complete honesty in any tagging system. And when the tag manufacturers haven't been honest to us in saying, buy this tag, it'll secure your markets, it'll last for the lifetime of the cattle, and the producers don't want it, then why should we comply? So we are working ways around being the system. And it's so bad now that producers don't even look at their database accounts. They just tag their cattle before they get on the truck, send them to market, and that's the end of it. And the database is in such a mess. There's about over 180 million tags on the NLIS database. 60 million of those tags represent what we call the ghost herd. So these are cattle which are meant to exist, but they don't. So that's just a rundown of where disease can come out in a sale yard. You know, of course, things like mad cow disease, you need testing to stop mad cow disease getting into the, or Bundy's encephalitis getting into the population. Tags don't stop it. We require a much quicker response time than 48 hours with a tag. So what we've found is that the ID won't help the control of foodborne diseases because there is no traceability from the paddock to plate. You hear that sounded out all over the world, and when MLA travel, they talk about how Australia has a system from paddock to plate. The tracing stops at the knocking box. So when the cattle are killed, the tags are stuck in the rubbish, hopefully taken off the database, sometimes they're not, and that is the end of it. You cannot buy a piece of meat, red meat, a piece of steak in Australia or any of our exports markets overseas, scan it and see a picture of the cow it's from. And after all, consumers really don't want to get to know the beast they're eating. So it's all pretty irrelevant. So now they're trying to work out who is liable for the lack of traceability of NLIS. So when a tag doesn't read or the tag doesn't match up with the NVD, the property it came from, they're trying to find out who they can blame. And there's a lot. But what the ABA has already established and made completely clear to the government, the liability does not lay with the producer. So at least we've won that battle so far. So I'll just go back to the audit and just give you an understanding of the scope of the audit that we did. So we picked 17 PICs, that's PICs, or properties, or ranches as you'll call them here, over nearly every state of Australia. Some were small farms with 100 cows, others were large operations with, I think the largest was 30,000 cattle. So we gave a really good range. So this is the largest audit that's ever been conducted on the efficacy of NLIS. So the audit covered around 57,000 tags. This tag size, I don't know if you have Morgan Gallup polls over here, but they have it in Australia to find out which way an election's going to go. So it was 20 times larger than the population used in a Morgan Gallup poll. And the outstanding result was that 34.5% of the study sample of the cattle to slaughter to date did not have lifetime traceability. So it's been a complete farce. There's a small graph there which just shows the breakup of the type of cattle that have lost their lifetime traceability. And the biggest thing that we also found in the audit is it's getting worse. So if you look at the top graph, it has systems on, has percentage of transfers off. So ideally, if the scheme was working well, you should have, apart from deaths, which would run at about 1.5 to 2%, when you on your farm, you should roughly tag the same amount of cattle each year that you sell off the property. So the systems on compared to systems off, there could be a small discrepancy, but it wouldn't be much. So you can see what's happening here. So 2005, you can take that out of the equation because that was the first year of NLIS. But you can see there's more and more cattle going on the system than taking it off the system. So all these ghost tags I'm talking about are remaining on the database and they'll never be taken off. For example, I normally run about 300 to 400 head of cattle. I had a quick look at my database account the other day. I have nearly 1,700 head of cattle on there. Now, the absurd thing is that the statisticians were going to use NLIS to get an accurate breakdown of the production capacity of Australian farms and how many cattle we produced. And they've certainly ditched that idea. Now, what I've done is a lot of argument over the costs of NLIS. So what I've done for you is just given you the most basic costs that no one can argue with. So there's 182 million tags on the database at $370 each, which is the lower end of the tagging price. 673 million. The agents have always introduced a scanning fee of $1.50 a head. So those most basic costs, the scanning and the tagging, come to 946 million. Replacement costs for non-readers, $36 each, would bring this figure to well over $1 billion. So that is after a 12-year period, 13-year period, you have 4 times the size of our herd. So over that same period of time, about 12 years, it would take out of the American cattle producer's pocket $4 billion in costs for something that doesn't work. Now, if there's any questions about NLAs, I can take them later on, but please come and talk to us. We'll be here for a while, but I just want to make sure that I'll send a copy of our report to Bill and the archive team so they've got the full copy of our report. Now, it's been quite prophetic today listening to people talking about trade, and I was here at your meeting this morning, and it could have been an ABA meeting. You are fighting exactly the same issues here as we are in Australia. We are an independent cattlemen's organisation which accepts no government money, and we're up against it big time. Your check-off's $1, our check-off is $5. So the amount of money we are fighting against is enormous. Now, Australia used to have a protectionist trade policy. We had a protectionist subsidised car industry, food manufacturing industry, clothing manufacturing industry, and our farms were protected. So in about 1970, they decided to change policy. So the National Party, which are meant to represent farmers, they started off as the Farmers Party. We now call them the International Party. They have gone on a free trade rampage. And this is what's happened. So in the 20 years to 2011, our food imports have increased from 3.9 to 10.6 billion. So that's in real dollars terms, discounting inflation. So an annual growth rate of 5.27% every year. Last year in Australia, we imported $17.64 billion worth of food and beverage into the country. We now import 70% of our processed pig meat and now 80% of our seafood in a continent that is surrounded by ocean. Our car industry finished 6 months ago. We do not manufacture a car in Australia anymore. So Australia is on the OAE and they are promoting free trade, saying what a wonderful job it's doing for us, and we've got to keep going with it. It is absolutely crucifying the capacity of our economy to not only provide basic manufactured and technological goods, but it's actually ruining a country which has produced enormous amount of surplus food. If this keeps going, in 30 years we'll be a net importer of food. So this is pretty current, this letter. So I sent this into the Land newspaper, Australia's biggest rural weekly. So our NFF, which is the National Farmers Federation, we called them No Family Farmers. They came out and condemned your government's administration for putting a $12 billion protection on soybean growers. So the NFF came out and wanted our government to lodge a protest over that $12 billion in subsidisation. So I wrote back into the Land condemning what the NFF have done, and that letter basically says it all. Now, we haven't had a lot of wins, the ABA, but the one win we did have in 2009, 2010, the Australian government decided to allow the importation of beef from countries that had BSE and foot and mouth. So the ABA lodged a protest. We had a couple of friends in Canberra, friendly senators. They launched a Senate inquiry into it. We had 3 hearings into the Senate inquiry. We were losing the race, so we said this is do or die. If we allow these beef imports into Australia en masse, we'll end up like the pig industry. So we had a huge rally in Armidale in the New England, not far from me. We had 1,100 producers there. We got a shock jock from Sydney, Alan Jones, the most popular radio commentator in Australia. Flew him in from Sydney at a fair cost. We did a presentation. We hit the airwaves. I think John Carter and I, in 6 weeks, we did 190 television and radio interviews. Alan Jones got me on his show, Sydney Morning, audience of 4 million people. He said to me, "Brad, what will you do if someone dies from BSE from eating foreign beef?" And I said, "I will charge that politician with murder." Half an hour later, the Minister for Agriculture reversed the decision and blocked the imports. But the sad footnote to that is that we've taken our eye off the ball with little publicity, and last week the first shipment of Japanese beef arrived in Australia. So in the end they beat us. So it's amazing what you can do, but you've got to although you get tired and you get sick of fighting, you've got to keep your eye on the ball, because the powers out there keep wanting to try and make money out of you. So you guys are a big importer of our beef, and it looks, I know I put those numbers up the screen, you would have thought, wow, you use a lot of Australian beef. But what I wanted to talk about is the effects of bilateral trade agreements. So we signed one with you guys in 2004, came into effect in 2005. The ABA was against it, didn't want our government to do it. Our government was so keen to say, we've finally got a trade agreement with the biggest economy in the world, aren't we great? So what they did was, they actually gave away all our bargaining power. So from the moment the free trade agreement came into fruition, all agricultural produce, bar beef, because it was kept out with mad cow disease, every agricultural produce was allowed into Australia completely tariff-free. On our side, we had tariffs lowered gradually over an 18-year period, with a snapback provision. If we reach certain tonnages and exports, then the maximum tariff would go on. So your tariff is about, I think, 22% on Australian beef going into the USA. So this has been the result of that free trade agreement. In 2004, our trade deficit with the USA was 6.4 billion. Last year, it jumped to 14.48 billion. And that's, you guys are great negotiators, well done, but that's what's happened to us. Now, the frightening thing is the Australian government is trying to lead the world in free trade, get rid of protectionists completely. They've now gone to China and they've signed Chapter, the Chinese-Australian Free Trade Agreement. This free trade agreement, when you read the document, and it took a fair bit of us to get the document, the complete document, before it was signed, in that document, it says that if the Chinese purchase a business in Australia worth more than $150 million, then that gives them the right to import their own labour to run that business. It is absolutely scandalous that this should happen. It also gives them the right, if that business loses profitability from a change in government legislation, then that company has the right to sue our government for damages. So that's free trade gone mad, and we're just desperate, but we're alone. NFF, National Party, Liberal Party are all for it. It's only now that the Labor Party, who are in opposition, who are meant to represent workers, are starting to think, hang on a minute, we're going to lose out on wage growth. Our wages will be suppressed. They might come on board with us. So I thought I'd do a little bit about, it's pretty hard going because you sell your cattle in cents or cents per pound or hundredweight. So I've done a little bit of work on this, just to give you an idea of how much. I'll just grab my notes. So at the moment, we have what they call the Eastern Young Cattle Indicator, so that's sitting at about $4.50 a kilo. 2 years ago, our cattle price really lifted. We had there was a shortage of cattle, a great season over Australia, and producers were trying to rebuild their herds, so competing with the processors went to $7.20 a kilo. So that $4.50 a kilo is dressed weight. So if you were to try and, I don't know when the notes anyway, if you were to try and convert that, you're looking about $2.04, $2.08 a pound for the beef, and then you convert it back to American dollars, it's about $1.80 to $1.90 a pound. So that's the equivalent of what you'd be getting for in America. And cow price is about $1.80 a kilo, and that's live weight. And at the moment, we've got a massive drought that's hitting Australia, so our herd is in liquidation, so the price of cattle is plummeting. So we have a very quick and hard drought which has hit New South Wales. So New South Wales, where I live, there's about 6 million cattle. Queensland to the north of me, that's the biggest cattle producing state with 11 to 12 million cattle. 100% of New South Wales is now in drought, and 80% of Queensland is now in drought. So the producers are now, it is so bad we're actually running out of hay stocks in Australia. We're drawing hay reserves from 4 or 5 years ago from Victoria. The price of wheat has gone from $220 to $450 a tonne. Cottonseed, which is a big cattle feed, that's gone from $300 to $700 a tonne in a month. So you can imagine there's a huge influx of cattle onto the market. So that huge influx of cattle on the market is suddenly allowing the processors to put the time that you can book when you book cattle and get them slaughtered out to 2 months. And what happens then is, so we have 3 big processors in Australia, a bit like what's happening in the States, that kills 70% of our cattle. We have Cargill's, an American company, JBS, a Brazilian company, which is the biggest, and then Nippon, a Japanese company. So those 3 get their heads together, and now they're forcing the price of cattle lower. Now, our feedlots in Australia, we only had the capacity for about 1.1, 1.2 million head of cattle. At the moment, and most cattle are sold as grass-fed beef. Only a small portion go through feedlots, unlike here. But our feedlots are absolutely chock-a-block full of cattle. So the meat processors own most of the feedlots in Australia. So of that 1.1 million capacity, Cargill's, JBS and Nippon would probably own about 800 to 900,000 head capacity. So there's been a bit of drawback with cattle prices going down, producers refusing to sell at such low price. So the processors, with their chock-a-block full feedlots, are now drawing out of the feedlots to keep their plants going and keeping the price of cattle down. It's a cyclical thing in Australia, but the problem is getting worse as the amount of processors dwindles and it's controlled by the bigger guys. And you can explain price all you like, but I'll just put this into, the best way I can put it into perspective is I purchased some Angus heifers 2 weeks ago for $300 a head, which is about $216 US, store heifers, and there's a photo of them. Not bad heifers, it's not the best photo in the world, but you can then get an idea. They weighed in about 190 kilos. So, great if you're buying, but if you're running a cow and a calf for 12 months and your return is only $300 a head, then there's only one way that you're going to go. Now, in Australia, we have around about 205,000 producers who produce lamb, mutton or beef. Of those, there's about 70,000 are beef specific and about 30,000 sheep specific, and about 100,000 are mixed growers. So I'd be your averaged mixed grower. So when I'm in full swing, I'd have about 400 head of cattle and about 4,000 sheep. I produce lamb, wool and beef to split the risks and a little bit of fodder cropping. But what has happened in Australia, because our returns to the producer in real terms keep dropping all the time, through imports and through concentrations of buyers, then we've had this big thing which our politicians have been telling us for years, and the NFF, they say, get big or get out. That's what you've got to do. So I got big. My parents, I grew up on a farm of 600 acres where we ran 600 sheep with 40 cows. I now have 4,600 acres running 400 cattle and 4,000 sheep. But the trouble is that you've got to do the work. I can't afford to employ anyone, so it's 7 days a week. Mum's in there helping me with the kid in the baby seat, and you are going flat out. My parents lived a good life. They had leisure time, spend time with the children. It was a great upbringing. But with this get big, get out theory, it's not fun anymore. So it's great to have a bigger farm, but it's just not working. So the burnout rate of Australian farmers is very, very high. The stress levels are extremely high. The debt levels in Australian agriculture, in 12 years, the debt level has gone from $26 billion to $70 billion. So that is producers buying more land to expand, to get economies of scale, low commodity prices, and trying to beat the cost of production. So what we're actually doing is borrowing money to produce food for our nation and for the 85 to 90 million people who rely on our exports. That's because we have no Stockyard and Packers Act in Australia. We have no one to protect the individual rancher. The ABA came along, set up the same year as RCAF, 98. We stood up for the rancher to try and get a better deal. We're depicted as these radicals. You know, how dare you attack free trade? How dare you attack a processor? How dare you want to bring a Stockyard and Packers Act in? And that's the problem we've got. So my message is, with RCAF, be so proud of what you have established, be proud of what you're doing for the United States cattlemen. Remember, you cannot rest. You cannot rest on your laurels. You've got to keep fighting. You've got to keep communicating with your members. and realise where the problems are and trying to break that down. And it's been such a pleasure to come over here, share some of my experiences with you. The ABA is here to help. We're here to swap ideas, swap strategies. We're cattlemen on two different continents which compete. We compete with each other in trade, but at the end of the day, we are cattlemen and women first, more than anything else. We have more in common with you guys than people in LA where we were or people in Sydney. We are like-minded. Take your accents away and you're fine. But thanks very much. Thank you.